Okay, let's get going. This morning we're talking about our most important subject, which is getting the soil right. So we have a little demonstration, but we'll talk first. Let's see. Here we go. Okay, so today's topic is soil and the problem with their industry. But first, so the soil is the key to how well your plants will do. More, just as important as the water. So water, sunlight, and the soil are the three most important things. But the thing that everybody's getting wrong, and it's not your fault, the industry hasn't corrected itself at all, is that they have the wrong concept of what soil is. And that's the whole problem, is that soil is essentially totally mineral. And the soils that are being promoted are essentially totally organic. Generally, they're chopped up plants or chopped up trees that have been decomposing for a bit, and that's what they want you to plant plants in, or they want you to amend the soil with it, but it's not the plant's home. So first, let's talk about what plants need from the dirt. So we were actually taught, at least when I was in school, incorrectly. They showed us that trees and their roots were mirror images, which is not true at all. The actual roots of a tree, and you've seen it in the news when they fall over, are very close to the surface. Generally in cities, they're no more than about a foot deep, maybe a foot and a half if the soil is really sandy, and that's because of what the plant needs from the soil. So the primary things that the soil has to provide for the plant, of course, one would be moisture. And I shouldn't even number these because they're all important. But the roots of a plant supply the water that the foliage needs. And if the plant's active, if it's green, it's using water constantly. And if the soil is dry at all for, say, 2 hours on a hot day, the tree is dead. They're using so much water on a warm day. Now, the upper part of a plant, so on a plant, anything above the ground is generally covered in wax. So it's fairly waterproof. They have little holes in the leaves where the water comes out. But the root system of the plant doesn't have that wax covering, or not much of it, so the water goes right into the root. But if the soil is dry, the roots just dry up. They don't have that wax covering that the top has. So the soil's got to have moisture. It's got to be constant moisture while the plant is green and growing. If it's dormant, it's not as important, but if it's growing, it needs that constant moisture. Number two, though, is oxygen and air exchange. And people don't think about that because the plant's creating oxygen, but it's not the entire plant that creates it. So the green cells, well, it's a chloroplast inside the cells of the plant that are green that create the oxygen. The rest of the plant, the inside of the stems, the roots, they all breathe oxygen. And plants, unlike animals, don't have a way to get the oxygen from the leaves to the roots directly. The oxygen goes out of the leaf, into the air, through the soil to where the roots are. So the soil has got to be able to breathe air. And that's one of the reasons, water, when it rains, doesn't go that far down, especially around here, so the roots can't be that deep. Plus, the air doesn't get into the ground as deep as, very deeply through dirt. So the roots are also close to the surface because they got to breathe. Now, fortunately, plants don't need as much oxygen as we do. If you got buried a foot deep, you'd be dead in 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Plants can hold their breath a lot longer. Most plants the roots have to breathe within, say, 2 days. So they're not necessarily as needy of oxygen as we are, but they still need it. They still need some source of oxygen in the soil. So the soil's got to have that air exchange to it. Now, number 3, and still just as important, insulation. Insulation. So the temperature at which roots operate, generally between 32 degrees Fahrenheit to about 85 degrees Fahrenheit. That's where they want to be, somewhere in that range. The roots of plants freeze if the soil freezes. Generally,
this is the temperature range for the roots.
Right. Not the top. And some plants are more sensitive than that, but in general, most of the plants we use, they don't want frozen dirt and they don't want it to be much above 85. That's typically where they operate the best. So insulation.
What about places where the ground freezes, like in the east?
It doesn't freeze very deep. So the only place where they have, quote, permafrost is up in Alaska in the United States. So, if the roots a foot deep are usually safe, the soil doesn't freeze that far down. So, so, in many parts of the Midwest, like when they grow roses there, they can freeze above the ground, but what they do is they just bury the rose in the dirt, and it doesn't freeze. Because the ground holds some heat. So, number 4 would be stability. You want the soil to be stable so the tree doesn't fall over, the plants don't fall over in the wind. So those are all important. We no longer put nutrition in this because soil, he thinks you're his mother, unfortunately. So we no longer put nutrition on this list because soil, for most plants, is not the source of nutrition. It's just this. This is their home. Just like your house, you don't eat your house. Your house is where you get water, you get air, you're insulated, it's stable, all those things the soil provides. It does not provide the food for most plants. Some plants, yes, most plants, no. And the problem we're having is in our trade, they're telling everybody, we have real nutritious soil. Well, that's because instead of selling you soil, they're selling you fertilizer instead of soil. So if you want...
That's how you should think of it.
Right. Soil is pretty much mineral. And so we'll talk about that. So there's 2 important terms that you should know about dirt. If it holds moisture, it's porous. So porosity is the ability to hold water. The ability to breathe is its permeability. And most journalists still get it wrong. They think if the air can get in there, it's porous. No, if the soil can retain water, it's porous. If it breathes well, it's permeable. So those are 2 terms we have to know. Now, so porosity is how much water, like a blotter paper or a sponge, they're porous. They have a lot of ways to capture the water. Whereas you can say sand is very permeable because there's a lot of air spaces between the particles in sand. So now proper soil is called loam. And a good soil, yeah, if it's good soil or what plants grow in is called loam. Gravel is not good soil. Loam. And what loam means is that the soil contains the 3 important parts that make up soil. Loam contains sand, silt, and clay. So those are the components of soil. What they are, let's illustrate here.
I know what silt is.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. So sand is the largest particle in the soil, and in this we have a little representation blown up. Now in this we made the tennis balls of sand, the silt is the little ping pong balls, and the clay are the lentil seeds. In actuality, the sand should be maybe the size of bowling balls. They should be a lot bigger than this. And the clay is probably better represented by confetti, real flat particles. So that's how soil works. Now, sand is primarily quartz. Sand can be made out of other things, but generally it's quartz. Silt is generally quartz also.
So what's the difference?
Size. So sand is about 20 times larger than silt. So silt is very fine particles of quartz, still fairly round. So sand's fairly round. Silt is fairly round also. Silt is like the chips that come off the sand. So sand and silt are both formed when the soil off the side of a mountain, which is often called decomposed granite because they're chunkier pieces. Once that gets into a river, the river tumbles them down and they become rounded particles, and the little chips fall off and they become the silt. The clay is actually, and I didn't bring my good visual aid here. So soil is made from granite. If you know what a granite rock looks like, grayish, it's actually a mixture of the light parts of granite are the quartz, the dark parts are the what is called feldspar. When that granite rock is broken up, the light parts become the sand and the silt. The dark parts become the clay. And that's what soil is. It's granite that's ground up. It's not dead stuff. It's just a piece of rock. The feldspar or clay is quartz also. Silicon dioxide is quartz, and so is glass. But it's combined with minerals like aluminum to make it gray, or iron to make it reddish or brownish colored. So the minerals, the metal minerals, iron, aluminum, magnesium, give the soil its color. The quartz make it lighter colored. And generally, if lightning hits the ground, you get glass, because the soil basically is glass, silicon dioxide. It's not wood. If lightning hits compost pile, it's going to burst into flames. And that's totally different than mostly quartz. So now this sample of soil is from a farm in Irvine. The head farmer there, who's very smart, he was once the what do you call it, the agricultural representative in California, state agricultural commissioner. He says the farm he's in Irvine has about as good a soil as he's ever farmed on. So we analyzed it, and this is how you analyze soil.
Is that just how it came? I mean, it wasn't amended or anything?
Right. Well, they amended, but you can still see there's very little organic matter in here. So we checked it out, and this is how you check out dirt. You get a mayonnaise jar. You fill it halfway or a little more with the soil. You add water to the neck, a few drops of dish soap. Shake it up really good for several minutes. Really get those clods broken up into little pieces, and then let it settle. And generally, soil, the sand falls to the bottom very quickly. What floats in the air overnight is the clay. Clay is such a small particle, it doesn't settle very fast. If I swirl this up, you can see the clay kind of swirling off the top of that pile there. The clay layer, if you're real up close to this, is only about maybe 8% of the whole height of this soil. So there's a real thin clay layer. So this has barely any clay in it. The sand's toward the bottom. The silt, which is just smaller sand, essentially, is above it. So this soil is only maybe 8% clay. Most of it's sand and silt. And here he says this is as good a soil as he's ever farmed in.
Okay, so if I wanted to do an experiment with some of the soil, I could do that?
Yes, oh yeah, any soil you can.
Just take some, put it in a mayonnaise jar or some jar, and then put, what, 2 or 3 drops of...
Yeah, several drops of soap in there, shake it up real good. Yeah. Now, we don't like to take the soil right off the surface. There's a lot of organic dead stuff there, so dig down about 6 inches, take that dirt, and put it in a jar. You might pull out some roots or things.
Yeah, I'll ask questions later.
So some of the areas around here, the clay layer, which looks like grease on top, the particles are so small in clay you can't see them. That clay layer will be 30, 40%, or even 40 or 50% of the volume, whereas the real good soils this came from, very sandy soil, it seems to be about 70% sand in here.
Okay. So
lots of sand.
When I try it, then, and I shake it a little, and if it's a whole bunch, then it's a lot clay, right? I mean, in other words, if there's a lot of cloudy.
Well, the clay will make the water cloudy all night. It takes overnight to settle that down.
I mean the next day.
Right, the next day, yeah, you'll see that layer on top that you can't see the particles in.
Right.
That'll be your clay. It looks like grease.
Oh, okay.
So that'll be your clay layer. And if you have, so the way this works, sand and silt are relatively round particles. Yeah. And in physics or geometry or whatever scientific study that is, if you have round particles, the round particles make up 2/3 of the volume, or 66% of the volume roughly, and the air spaces between them 33% of the volume. And between sand and silt, there's really good airflow. That's a lot of big open spaces. Now, air moves better through big openings than small openings. So sand breathes better than silt. Silt breathes a lot better than clay. Clay, the spaces between it's so small, there's so much friction there that the air has a hard time moving through it.
What shape are the...
Clay is relatively flat. So they pack down just like confetti, or there's not much movement, air movement through there when they pack down like that.
And it makes sense because when you look at clay and feel it, that's what it kind of feels like.
Right, it's very dense material. So what happens is if you have a very sandy soil, the air flows through very well. If you've got a clay soil, it doesn't move well at all. Now, the other thing we didn't mention is that various types of plants have various needs for oxygen. So, and the scientists know that. So the plants toward the right end of this table can get by with less oxygen, and conspicuously we know that palms, conifers like this is a cedar, pines, cedars, junipers can get by with very little air in the ground. Most palms can too. Daisies, interestingly, can get by with very little oxygen in the roots. A lot of the lilies, like daylilies, can get by with little air. And grasses, most of the grasses don't need that much air around the roots. There's always exceptions, but in general, these plants can get by with lower air and lower oxygen levels in the soil. On this side of the table, we have the plants that need more oxygen.
What's that over there? Is that a tomato plant?
Yeah, tomatoes don't need much air either,
Okay.
at least the hybrids. On this side are the plants that they've noted need more oxygen. One definitely would be strawberry plants. The strawberry farmers have to usually raise the beds pretty high so the roots can breathe well. One of the worst we've seen is English lavender. You get a little bit, yeah, English lavender.
You mean, but there's so many kinds of lavender.
Right. Some of them aren't as picky, but English, a little lack of oxygen, they just rot. Tarragon, also very sensitive. Gardenias are noted. Everybody's killing gardenias off. Dracaena palms seem to rot fairly easily.
What about like violas?
Yeah, but petunias, violas, they tend to rot in the ground if there's not enough oxygen. Here's your petunias, they rot. And among tree crops, avocados are noted for rotting. So, and a lot of the natives, here's a ceanothus, California native. Now this one is just getting too big for the pot. That's why the leaves are getting ugly. But they also rot very easily. Now, the problem with their industry is they're blaming all of this on too much water. They're making water the villain.
That's interesting.
But plants love water. I mean, the more it rains, the better everything looks.
Look at how everything looks
Right.
now after our winter.
So our industry has somehow gotten really weird because they're blaming it on water.
And what about the what do you call that? The one with the stalk with the leaves coming out.
Well, this is a French hybrid lavender called Goodwin Creek. Goodwin Creek is the sturdiest of the lavenders. It can take poor conditions in the soil than the other lavenders. So I put it on this more closer to the center. Now, avocados, you know, they'll tell you if you water too much, it rots. Well, the thing about avocados that almost everyone's done is they've taken the pit and grown it in a glass of water. There's no drainage there. It's just 100% water. And the avocado can live in that water for years. No root rot. It's not the water that causes the rotting. So all these plants, it's not the water that causes rotting. Now, it is a condition. So if there's low oxygen in the water, that's when you get the rot. So low oxygen is the key. It's not just the water.
So
That
what causes low oxygen in water? I mean,
we'll explain that. So in a clean glass of water, so in the tap water that comes through your pipes, there's enough oxygen in there. And if you want to know what that is, the water districts know that the oxygen content has to be. This pin is. Let's switch pins here. So the oxygen content in tap water is generally 6 to 8 parts per million. So per million parts of water molecules, there's got to be 6 to 8 oxygen molecules for plants to have enough air to survive. Fish are probably similar depending on the fish. Now, the plants on this side can probably go down to about 2 parts per million. The plants on this side need those 6 to 8 parts per million of water.
but this is what regular tap water produces.
Yeah.
So it shouldn't be any problem.
Right. So the more water you put in a plant, it's not going to drown it because the water has got enough oxygen in it. Now, what takes oxygen out of the water? Now, if the water doesn't move at all for a week, the roots of the plant will eventually, as they respire, they're using up the oxygen. If the water doesn't move, the roots will eventually use up all the oxygen in the water, and the oxygen levels drop low, and then root rot organisms start attacking. So if the water can't move, that's poor drainage. If the water just sits there in the same spot on the ground, and it doesn't move, and it's not close to the surface where it can exchange oxygen with the air, then you're going to have a problem with low oxygen. Now, if you have an avocado pit in a glass of water, in a glass of water, the water circulates in that glass very easily. So it just keeps gathering oxygen as it rises to the surface of the glass. So as long as the water's got access to the atmosphere, it's going to have plenty of oxygen in it. The problem would be is if there's something in the water that's using it faster than the plant's roots. Well, generally that would be compost. So people have argued with me that compost no longer decomposes. Well, that's not true at all. They tell me that they're using finished compost. Well, when compost is finished decomposing, it's carbon dioxide and water. That's what it turns into. This is still decomposing all the way until it disappears. You put this in water, and in about a week, just a pinch of this in a glass of water, and in about a week, it'll smell like a sewer in there. It's used up all the oxygen in that water so quickly that it can't be replenished just from the surface, and it's starting to stink. It stinks because under low oxygen levels, the compost is now decomposing anaerobically, making sewer gas. For those of you watching on the video, while we're waiting for the audience to settle back down, a note about our potting soils that we'll be talking about today. They can be purchased pretty much at any garden center on the West Coast through a distributor. Most nurseries use L&L Nursery Supplies, and I just put on here the catalog number because a lot of the sales reps don't know how to look it up. But our potting soils, which we grow most of our plants in, and they do quite well in it, and it's a permanent soil. We'll talk about that. This is your order numbers for the sales reps' benefit. Okay, we're back. So one thing about the soil, so in general, nature soils are a combination of sand, silt, and clay, and what they call a rich loam. Now, one of the interesting things that's happened in journalism too, or in horticultural, is they've got the terms all mixed up now too. So in modern journals tell you they want a rich soil that's black and rich, they'll tell you mix a lot of dead stuff in it. Well, the original rich soil was soil that had more clay. So in fact, I better talk about this a little bit. So the way soil holds water, let's first kind of illustrate how this works. So sand being the big particle, clay being the real small flat particles. If you look at soil underneath a magnifying glass, or especially underneath a microscope, you'll notice that if it's, unless it's bone dry out in the desert, each particle has got a thin layer of water clinging to it. So soil's got a negative charge in general, and water molecules, hydrogen, oxygen, of course they're a lot smaller than I'm showing here, they have a positive and negative charge. They're ionic, and the positive side sticks real hard to that sand, or any soil particle, so there's a layer of water stuck to it with the hydrogen stuck onto the negative part of this sand, at least one molecule thick and thicker. Silt, a smaller particle, has the same layer of water stuck to it. Now clay can be minutely the size of sand, but they still have at least one layer of water stuck to them.
Oh, they do?
And clay can be, so you got one molecule layer stuck to clay. Now clay can be as thin as 28 molecules thick, and they still got one molecule of water stuck to them. Sand is thousands of molecules thick, maybe even close to 1 million, and it doesn't hold. So it versus its size, sand doesn't hold that much water. Clay holds a lot of water because it's such a small particle. It's the size that makes it hold more water than the sand, because they're mostly the same material. They're still mostly quartz, silicon dioxide. It's just the way they're constructed. Sand is a rounder particle, clay is a flatter particle too. The flatness also makes it hold more water. So a foot of sand, if you had a foot tall jar of dry sand, if you added about a half inch of water, it would soak it through. So sand can hold about a half inch of water before it starts dripping out below that foot. Clay, it would take almost 5 times as much water. So clay would absorb inch and a half, 2 inches, even 2.5 inches of water before it started dripping out the bottom. So clay has got a lot more water retention than sand does. So if you go back 100 years ago, the farmers didn't like this soil. This soil dried out too fast. Back 100 years ago, they didn't really have the modern irrigation technology. So after the rains were over, the soil was damp. This soil would dry out in a month. The clay soils would hold a lot more water. So the farmers liked, quote, the rich clay soil. So the rich, right, the rich soils were the clay soils. The poor soils were the sandy soils. So there are still some notations out there that will tell you that tarragon needs poor soil. They're not saying, they're not talking about compost. They're talking it needs more air, it needs more sand in it. Whereas the rich soils, some crops like a richer soil, but it needs more because they need more water. This needs more air, and then the plants that need a richer soil need more water. Now, clay also helps because water is associated with nutrients. The nutrients are dissolved in the water. The soils that have more clay also hold more nutrients. But the rich soil versus the poor soil was clay versus sand. It wasn't the fact that it had more. In nature, there is no organic matter in the ground. There is none. University of New Hampshire had an article. Right, it's on top. So, University of New Hampshire, for the last 50, 60 years, they said that natural soil was less 1% organics, 99.1% mineral, 0.9% organic. But University of New Hampshire came out with an article less than 2 years ago that said, no, that's wrong. When we study the soil very carefully, we get zero organic matter or zero dead things in the dirt. They said that the dead stuff that other surveyors are apparently come up with was things they were killing as they were doing the survey that were not being counted properly. So very little to no dead stuff in the soil. But rich loam.
What kind of, were they using like forest soil or were they?
Yeah, any soil in the U.S. when they surveyed it.
New Hampshire I go there every year, so
very little organic matter in the ground.
Huh.
So rich loam would be a little more clay, say 20% clay. It could be 30% silt, 50% sand. That would still be, you get that clay in there, it makes it richer. Now sandy loam has more clay. More clay.
Oh, okay. Is this defined by the current industry or just what?
Well, the original description of rich loam was clay, soil that had a significant amount of clay in there.
Right, because it kept moisture.
Right. It stayed wetter better.
Yeah.
I mean, in the old days, if you remember, they farmed in Los Alamitos, Cerritos, those areas near the ocean where the soil is more clay-like. The rivers, what happens is the mountains around here have sand and clay in them. And as the rivers carry it down to the ocean, the sand being the heavier particle falls out first. So this area is more sandy. You get toward the ocean, as the rivers slow down, the clay is finally dropped out of there. So Newport, Costa Mesa, especially as you get into the low areas around there, Fountain Valley, clay soil. But that's where all the farmers before World War II were, is right there because they had clay. Now the farmers love Anaheim, Garden Grove, Irvine, closer to the foothills because that's where the sandy soil is. Plants grow faster where the soil breathes better. So the sandy soils are better for speed of growth. the clay soils hold the water better. But anyway, sandy loam is more or less about 40, well, say 60, 30, 10. This soil here we figure is about 70, 25, 5. So very little clay in that soil from Irvine. But the farmers love it. The plants grow really fast in that. They have to water more. So generally on farms now, they found, we'll talk about that next week in next week's class, but farmers pretty much water every day. It's more efficient than watering once a week like they used to do. So this soil grows plants really fast. The farmers love that. A clay soil, so clay is so between silt and sand, you got silt and sand that are the round particles. The air spaces in here represents 1/3 of the volume. If there's 1/3 clay in the soil, it fills up all those gaps, and then the soil doesn't breathe. So it doesn't take much clay to turn a soil into non-breathing. So anything that has, say, 35, 40% clay or more is now a clay soil. So you can have a lot of sand in it, 40% sand, 20% silt, 40% clay, and it'll be a clay soil because the air doesn't move through too well. That clay is filling up all the gaps. So the foothills of Orange County are considered sandy clay. There's a lot of sand in there, but there's enough clay to mess up the airflow. So it doesn't breathe well. There's a lot of sand in it, but the clay has filled all the gaps.
So where is this that you're talking about?
In the foothills of Orange County.
Oh, I thought you said it was better inland, but
Well,
not.
okay. So in Orange County, you got foothills. Then you have the slopey soil. Then the ocean's out here.
Yeah.
So the foothills are sandy clay. All my boot pins are getting dry. The Anaheim's a good example. So this area is very sandy. And then Fountain Valley is a good example of clay as you go toward the ocean. So Santa Ana is right here, is in the sandy zone. The 5 freeway is kind of right about here. The 405 freeway is right about here. So as you approach get toward the 405 and out toward the ocean, you get into more clay. So these hills have sand and clay. The sand's deposited first and the clay later. So in general, if you've got a sandy soil, plants grow faster as long as you can provide the water and the nourishment. In clay soils, they don't dry out as fast. Now, clay's not poisonous, but if you have a plant growing in compost, the wrong stuff. If you have a plant growing in the wrong material, this compost stuff, and you put it in clay, it just rots. Because it doesn't, clay is like a little jar of water, and then with that compost being surrounded by clay, it doesn't breathe well as it's decomposing in the water, and the plant just rots right out. So that's where you have the problem. If you have, in the sandy soil, if you have a plant in the wrong dirt. So the problem with their industry right now is that the growers are using compost as a soil. So I can see a little bit of sand in this root ball. Now, I'm not going to blame the growers. It's not their call. They were told by the universities, by academia, to make the soil lighter weight so it's easier to handle, to add. Now, originally, they're supposed to add peat moss. So peat moss is a plant that died thousands of years ago. It doesn't decompose fast at all. Mix that with sand, you got a good soil. Well, it's great and it works. Because peat moss, you can put peat moss in water, the water doesn't stink. It decomposes too slowly. But because peat moss has always been pricey, The growers, they told the growers, oh, you can use ground up bark or ground up wood. So the growers are doing that, and wood and bark decompose much quicker. Months instead of like the peat moss, 5 years before it breaks down. Bark may break down in 6 months. It really fast decomposition. So when you're growing plants in it and you set them in heavy clay soil that doesn't have any airflow and you water it, it's like being in a glass of water and it just rots in there. If the plant wasn't in that stuff, no problem in the clay. But
Can I interrupt you for a minute since I'm the only one?
sure.
I planted the 3 blueberries that I put, next to the one that I've had for about 10 years. Noticing that those berries are much smaller in size than those little brand new little plants. Was I supposed to shake out all the dirt that it was planted in?
We're coming up to that, yes.
Because I didn't.
Do you buy them from who?
You.
Well, they're fine.
Oh, okay. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, the blueberries we sell generally are fine.
Okay.
They're in our soil.
Yeah, okay.
But the growers, other growers, and I don't know any grower still in business that does a soil that we like. Now, there may be some in San Diego that I'm not using that we like. There's some growers whose plants seem to survive in the wood products better than others, and some that, within 3 years, we know they'll all be dead even faster than that. So, in fact, most plants, if you leave them in the original containers, they don't breathe because they're plastic. Most of these plants are not sellable within 6 months of when we get them. Now, one of the reasons why the trade doesn't recognize, we believe the trade doesn't recognize that there's a problem is because of most nurseries are not growers. Most garden centers are not growers, they're just distributors. And most garden centers get rid of all their plants before fall in the U.S. because in the fall it freezes, and anything in the container that's not in the ground freezes too. So in the Midwest, the East, anywhere north of San Francisco, those nurseries buy their plants in the spring, and by August, September, they're out of the store. So at that period of time, which is only 3 or 4 months, this wood product or bark product that they use as a soil hasn't had a chance to break down far enough that ruins the airflow. So the thing about compost is that it can work for a while. So what the research shows is if you want to grow a plant, it actually grows fastest in ground up bark. And what you do with it is you let it rot in a pile for 3 months because it rots very quickly at first. You don't want to subject the plant to that because that'll kill it. And for about a 5-month period, it rots slower. It still has good airflow. It retains moisture decently. So for 3 to 5 months, it's an excellent growing medium, and it actually works better than dirt because it's more permeable. It's more airy. Sawdust is airier than soil in a pot. So for a 5-month period, it's good enough. They can grow a plant in it. The plants are sold. The grower, most wholesale growers never know what happens to their plants. The garden centers get all the blame, and they just tell the customers, oh, you watered too much. The next year, you watered too much, your plant rotted away. It's not our fault. And that's the state of our industry, is that no one sees it happen because, in the old days, the nursery that grew the plants sold directly to the public. They heard all this. And so they knew that when something was going wrong. Well, nowadays, they don't. They sell to the nursery, and the people at the nursery don't know what's going on. They just tell the customers, oh, you overwatered it. Even though it died 2 or 3 years down the road, they think it's the customer's fault. It's not their fault. So what we've seen, when the grower grows their plants in organic matter, that we noticed that from one of our suppliers, so 25 years ago, my last house that I purchased, we planted it with plants from various suppliers, all the same types of plants. We noticed from one grower, they all died 3 months almost to the date that we planted them. For another grower...
So you were doing a little experiment.
Well, we didn't know it was an experiment. We thought,
Oh.
we bought these from this grower, and then we bought this from another. We just wanted to share the different growers in our garden. From another grower, all their plants died in 5 years. From a third grower, all their plants died within 10 years of when I planted them. But from three other growers, none of their plants ever died. The same plants lived the entire time I was at that house, no problems. And those growers did not use the same materials that the other three did. So one grower used only peat moss and sponge rock, no problems. The two other growers, instead of using what is now common fir bark and pine shavings, things like that, they use redwood sawdust. Now the thing about redwood sawdust is that it decomposes even slower than peat moss. Redwood sawdust apparently takes 7 years to decompose, so it decomposes at a very slow rate. Now plants don't like redwood sawdust, but at least it keeps the roots breathing. Redwood sawdust has all these tannins in it, poisons in that it keeps.
Not good. Oh,
it's not good for the plants, but it won't rot them.
okay.
They don't look pretty in redwood because of all the chemicals that redwood has that prevents redwood from rotting.
Right.
But at least it doesn't rot them. So the growers I had that used redwood in sand and redwood in soil, their plants made it. Peat moss, those plants made it, but the other growers using pine or fir, their plants all rotted away and died. I mean, when you pull them out of the ground, we noticed that the roots in our soil were fine. They looked good, but the rotting was occurring right below the stem of these plants, right in the original root ball. Well, that's where it was occurring. So we knew there was something going on, and we finally consulted with a soil scientist who was sending potting soil up into the space shuttles in the 80s and 90s, and they were really incredulous, or they didn't know what our industry was doing. They said, "You guys are crazy." They said, "The horticulture industry in the United States, no one seems to know how to grow plants. In agriculture, they know what they're doing. Horticulture, and especially the people who are studying how to grow plants in containers, don't seem to get it, mainly because of the practice of selling the plants within 3 to 5 months of starting them in the pots. So they're using soil that doesn't last any longer than that. A growing medium that doesn't have
Not having any fall through.
any sustainability at all. They think that the compost turns into air. Well, it may do that if the soil around it is very permeable. If it's very sandy, gravelly, or decomposed ground where the air goes through there, well, then it might decompose. Well, then it can decompose properly to nothing. But if you've got heavy clay soil around it, it looks like sewage forever. It seems to just turn black, get sludgy. Yeah, it doesn't breathe, and then the plant rots, or it just stunts it for a long time. When I was growing up, my parents planted citrus in their yard. They had a clay yard. They put citrus in the ground. The citrus growers from the 70s on were growing them in some kind of wood product. So the plants would sit there. They wouldn't die, but they would turn to sticks and twigs with like a dozen or 2 dozen leaves on them. For 4 to 5 years, they'd go downhill. And then for another 3 or 4 years, they'd recover. And by the 8th or 9th year, all the citrus were doing well, looking good, performing well. And I thought, boy, citrus take a long time to get going. Well, in the 80s, when I bought my first house, I bought my trees from an orchard supplier, not a retail supplier, an orchard supplier, the ones that grow the plants for the ground. Their plants were in solid sand. Put them in the ground. They grew 3 feet within the first year, had a crop that I could harvest, and I figured, boy, the retail citrus are terrible. How could people grow them? And to this day, if you've got heavy soil, you put a citrus in the ground, you've got trouble. If you've got sandy soil, you can succeed, but in clay, there's just no way. I mean, you look at that plant, it's just going to sit there and sit there and sit there for up to a decade. We've seen it sit for up to a decade without growing because of the soil that the grower had used. So here, and again, you can't blame the growers. It's the people who taught the growers what to use.
It's kind of the system. It's a system, like our health system.
There's a lot of, quote, academia out there that are preaching the wrong things, and they will not change.
So you discovered it by your own
Well, we were.
experimentation that you weren't even.
Well, we did our own experiments, but we were. This research scientist alerted us because we were in the late '80s. We were so frustrated because we'd use more and more planter mix, wouldn't get good results. We'd use the potting soils that are available to us, wouldn't get good results. We were killing a lot of things, and we didn't know what to do. We had to invent all these new. So let's go back in a little history. So when I was a kid back in the 50s, my dad grew all the plants in this exact material, sandy loam.
And where was that?
In Pasadena, California.
Pasadena.
He watered everything every day, did not have any problem with root rot. All the people, the only thing they ever complained about, they pulled the plants out of the pot, and the roots going around and around, nice healthy white roots going around and around and around. They said, oh, your plants are root bound. Nowadays, if you pull a plant out of the pot, you're lucky if you see roots. There's just not many roots in there. But in the old days, yeah, this was the soil we used, no problems. It was in the 1960s when they started wanting to lighten the load, and that's when they told the nurserymen sand and peat moss. Now, peat moss has always been pricey. A lot of the nurseries in the 60s, and I remember this because my dad's dirt pile changed to redwood sawdust and sand. Again, redwood decomposes very slowly. We had quite a good success. The plants didn't look as, nowadays when I look at them, the plants didn't look as good as they did in real dirt, but they grew faster and they were lighter, easier to handle. In the 80s is when it really changed because the virgin redwood forests were gone, all cut down. Redwood got very expensive. So most nurseries went to wood shavings. And they told my father, oh, you got to go to this fir shavings and soil. So we changed that in the 1980s, and everything started to rot. And the agriculture department came in, and my dad talked to them. They told my dad, you can't water your plants every day. It's your fault. He had watered his plants every day from the time he started business to the 80s. From the 50s to the 80s, never had a problem. Suddenly, in the 80s, he wasn't allowed to water every day. And that's when he turned everything over to me. He says, you figure this out. I'm totally clueless. I just can't figure this out. I've watered my plants every day for 30 years, never had a problem. And suddenly, I can't do it anymore. So we had to make up all these new rules to handle this soil. Water only when the surface of that root ball looked totally dry. So you just have to check your plants every day. Once they look dry across the top, you can water them. If they look moist at all on top and you water them, within a couple days the leaves start turning yellow. If you put too much new dirt around the plant, you'd kill it. And they're still saying that today. You can't put too much potting soil around a plant because you kill it. Well, that's because there's so much fresh compost there, there's no oxygen left. The more you put in around the plant, the less oxygen, the faster it's going to die. I remember one of the first things I tried to grow in my house, a Dracaena palm, which is a high oxygen user, put in a big pot with, at that time, the best potting soil I think was super soil. Surrounded with that, it rotted and fell over within a month. I couldn't believe it. I said, indoor plants are too difficult to grow. Can't grow them. Now it turns out only one indoor supplier knew what they were doing. And they still do it today. I believe this is Rancho Soledad down in the San Diego County. They've always used volcanic rock. I think it's volcanic rock and peat, might be coconut, but mostly volcanic rock. And that soil will stay permeable forever. No matter what happens to the peat or the coconut core, this stuff will breathe. So their plants have never had problems. This is the right soil to grow an indoor plant in. But none of the other growers get it. We had one grower whose owner was a professor of horticulture, and when they started having trouble, what they did, use bigger pieces of wood. Because the little pieces were decomposing too fast, so they used bigger pieces of wood. Well, that leads to the same thing further down the road. So in the future, their plants will rot because the bigger chunks will still turn to sludge as they decompose. But so they don't get it. They should just go back to straight sand or something lighter. So in the early 1990s, when it took us 10 years to figure the problem out and get the right soil. So what the research scientists said, they're growing plants in straight pumice. Now pumice is silicon dioxide, just like glass, just like sand and everything. For the space shuttles, they wanted to use pumice, but unfortunately pumice does float in outer space without gravity.
Oh,
so they turned to spun glass, which is similar to this rock wool. So the space shuttle used spun glass. So
what is pumice made of?
it's silicon dioxide. Same as sand.
Sand.
It's just pumice is molten silicon dioxide. Yeah, because it's volcanic gases are blown through it. So it's mostly air. Pumice rock like this is 70% air, whereas sand, the space between them is 30% air. So there's a lot more air in pumice than in sand. Right. And there's various types of pumice too. Some pumices I have some in my house, you can put in your hand and blow on it, it just floats. It's so airy. Just depends on the volcanic gases that came through that. But perlite is man-made pumice. They take quartz and pop it in an oven, quartz with some water in it. And so perlite is also. Now, well, let's go over this real fast. So these are proper things to grow plants and all the mineral things. One of the more interesting things that are being used is clay pellets. So the clay holds the water, and when it's fired in the pellets, it breathes well. It's very permeable because there's a lot of air spaces between the clay pellets. And this is one of the most efficient ways to grow plants, especially in hydroponics. So the most expensive crops, generally, they use the best soil. So most marijuana crops are grown in clay pellets because it works really, really well. It's got a lot of advantages to it. I mean, a lot of hothouse farmers use rock wool. There are foam plastics that also work. As long as they can hold the moisture, some moisture, because in hydroponics they're watering constantly.
And so they're always in this.
Right. Right. So it breathes real well. The air is the key. The better the roots can breathe, the more vigorous the plants grow. Now, there are some organic materials that are recommended for use. Rice hulls, which are the hulls of a rice kernel, turn out to be 90% silica. Almost
90%?
Yeah, almost total mineral. So rice hulls, you can say, just don't decompose in our lifetime.
Wow.
So that's the only problem with rice hulls, they're extremely lightweight and they blow around too much. But in indoor hydroponics, a lot of the farms use this. Now there's two organic materials that have known lifespan. So coconut coir and peat moss, quite uniform materials. Peat moss is usually good for about a year, maybe not quite a year before it gets sludgy. Coconut coir about the same. So short crops are fine in these two. And if you have a crop that takes 3 months like lettuce, or lettuce is actually 1 month or 2 months, any short crop, these are fine. Any long-term crops can't use it by itself.
So you're talking about hydroponics then?
No.
Oh.
Even regular farming, indoor gardening, if you're growing a short crop, you can use peat, but it won't work long term because it doesn't last long enough. Now, back in the early 90s, we're trying to find a new way to make potting soil because we noticed that, what happened? So the researcher we're talking to was using straight pumice. Well, pumice rock, no one's going to buy that as potting soil. That doesn't look right. No one's going to think rocks are a substitute for potting soil. We wanted to just check out to see how well sand worked. So for one of the first things we did, we had big pots of sand and a big pot, same size pot of the potting soil of that time, an organic potting soil, which they still are today, full of nutrition. And we put strawberry plants in each one. The strawberry plant in the organic material grew about this size, which is typical of what we've seen. In pure sand, the same strawberry plant was 2 foot across. And we're going, okay, that potting soil, the organic potting soil, is pure poison. We couldn't believe the difference. And so we started growing all the different vegetables, and we got the same results with all of them. Even though the vegetables will grow in the organic soil, they were far smaller and more poorly colored than they were in pure sand. Sand is the original potting soil. If you go back into the literature, my dad's bonsai book said plants grow most vigorously in sand and pots. You know, bonsai people are experts at growing plants in containers. They slow down the growth to make the leaves smaller by adding clay to it, small amounts of clay. But they said, yeah, if you ever have any problems, change the dirt back to sand. Sand is the most, you know, they never mention organic matter in bonsai over thousands. They never thought of using dead plants as dirt. Why do we do that? You know, it just doesn't make sense. But anyway.
Did they have to feed the plants?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they have to feed.
Yeah, well, feed is different than the dirt.
Right.
Now, what we noticed about sand, it's just too heavy. So the 18-inch pot full of sand that we grew the strawberry plants in, that already weighed about 60 pounds, 70 pounds. There's no way you can sell sand as potting soil. And pumice, which is a lot lighter than sand, we thought, well, we can work with pumice, but pumice dries out too fast. We asked the guys at UC Riverside what holds the water the best for plants. They said peat moss. So as the first thing we did, we said, okay, let's try this where you add equal amounts of both. This for air, this for water retention. And so the first thing we came up with, we call it our acid mix, is just half peat moss and half pumice rock. And to this day, it works quite well. Having the best air holding material and the best water holding material works. Even though the peat moss breaks down within 5 years, it doesn't mess up the airflow because there's enough pumice in there to keep the air going.
So it is half pumice and half?
It's half pumice and half peat.
That's what I've been planning.
Right. So it to this day it works, and it seems to last a long, long time. It does shrink a little because the peat moss does lose some volume. So we came up with a different soil, which is called our top pot. So this one is 1/3 peat, and the rest of it is inert. Pumice, 1/3 peat. I don't know the exact numbers on it.
2/3 something else?
Right, 2/3 something else. So it's got perlite, pumice, sand, and charcoal in it. Charcoal's inert.
I mean, all 2/3.
2/3 are those 4 items. Perlite, pumice, sand, and charcoal. All inert materials. They don't change. They will provide a permanent permeability. The peat moss holds the moisture. Not quite as well as the acid mix, because acid mix is half peat. This is 1/3 peat. But it doesn't seem to shrink. Even though the peat moss is shrinking, this seems to hold the volume. We think the peat moss is sitting between the larger pieces and it's not contributing to volume. So after if you use our top pot, you water it for a week or so, it settles a bit, and then it doesn't shrink anymore the rest of the plant's life. At least we haven't seen it. So that seems to be our best permanent potting soil. Now in containers.
Oh, that's the best permanent potting soil in the ground or
in a pot.
In a pot.
It works in the ground too. There's no reason a good soil should not work in the ground also.
Yeah, but I mean if you're hunting for something. So like, well, when you I just have.
So this one we like because it doesn't shift, it doesn't sink, it doesn't do any of that other stuff that this potentially can shrink a little, but this does not. I mean, the problem we're having with our growers' plants, especially their trees, when they use that organic soils, is within a year they're all doing this. They all lean. So we're having to sell a lot more stakes these days because you sell trees to any other grower, and after a year they're leaning because the soil below the root system is collapsing. So they're leaning one way or the other. They don't stay straight up. When we grow a plant ourselves, it's ramrod straight all its life. It doesn't move because sand, all these materials, they can't bend. So that plant is just straight up. But nowadays, every plant, this tree has got to be staked up because they're all going to lean. Now, there's a few growers out there, and they don't sell generally to retail, but they're the landscapes, people who plant plants for landscape use in the green belts. They don't use very much organic matter. They don't use that much because they don't care if their pots are heavy. So their plants tend not to lean as badly. So there are some growers out there that you won't see in retail nurseries. They don't sell to retail nurseries that have actually pretty decent plants because they don't spend the money and try to make their soil organic, too organic. They still do it because they've been told to, but they don't do very much. And so one of the growers we use is one of those growers, what's called West Covina Nursery. They don't use as much organic matter as other companies. Now they've been experimenting with some of the trickier plants and adding more organic matter, and those have been dying. I try to teach them to go the other way and put them in more mineral, but we'll see what happens. I don't have a PhD, so they may not listen. So anyway, we made our top pot in particular to grow gardenias, because gardenias have been a sore point for most homeowners. They grow gardenias, they turn yellow within 6 months and die. So we grow gardenias, our own gardenias, in our own top pot. We find gardenias to be about the easiest plant to grow from a cutting that we've ever seen. You say, take a cutting, stick it in good soil, it doesn't die. Gardenias are really easy, but if you put them in compost, they can't take it. Same thing with lavender, though. If you start English lavender in good soil from seeds, once that thing starts up, can't kill it. That's a really strong plant, but just a pinch of ground up tree near the root system, near the crown of that plant underground, causes all kinds of problems. So a lot of the plants that used to be easy are now almost impossible to grow just because in the last 2 generations the growers have changed the dirt. I mean, pansies used to be a piece of cake, but nowadays they're rotting left and right because the growers use wood.
I was told that, I don't know, I was told maybe nematodes in the soil, or I don't
Yeah, both pansies and petunias get crown rot. So there's not enough oxygen near the crown of the plant, they rot, and you pick them up, there's nothing attached to the top. The roots are gone. So that's the soil. That's the soil the growers use. It could be the soil that you have to. I mean, the one thing we want to tell everybody to know is do not buy anything called topsoil. Anything called topsoil, the people who make topsoil are people who know tractors and dump trucks, and they think if they take good sandy loam, which is dirt cheap, and mix it with manure and compost, suddenly they have a really nutritious soil you can grow plants in. Well, I learned about soil because I bought topsoil back in the early 90s from my soil supplier because I thought they knew what they were doing. So we bought 17 truckloads, 170 cubic yards of it, filled up all our raised planters in our backyard, put plants in, and within 6 months, about half of them had rotted and fallen over or just died. And we go, well, what happened? Well, that's when we met up with the soil scientists, told us what was going on. It took me 10 years to replace all the topsoil in my yard with sandy loam. And we noticed when we were digging out the topsoil, there was one stray root going through it about every 6 inches. A few more roots at the top of it where they can breathe better, but in the topsoil itself, maybe one root every 6 inches. once we replaced it with real dirt, and we dug up the soil 6 months after we replanted, there was a root every quarter inch running through that soil. So this real dirt without the compost can hold, I think that's 24 times more roots than this topsoil can support. There's not enough air in there to support much root. Maybe one root every 6 inches versus one root every quarter inch. So the topsoil is much healthier for the roots. The roots are able to grow in it much better.
So what was in the topsoil besides sand? The thing?
The company that was making their topsoil was using horse manure and general just ground up local trees and shrubs, composted. So they thought their soil was the best thing in the world, and well, the only good thing that happened is it taught me all about dirt. I learned about dirt because of that. Otherwise, I would have been in the same boat as everyone else, thinking that the more organic matter you add to the ground, the better it is. Well, here they made theirs 40%, wiped out everything. So the University of California went around the farms of California in the year 2000. They wanted to check the organic content of the ground because they wanted to see how the farmers were doing. And they had mentioned back in 1950, when they had originally checked the farms, they said the soil organic content is 0.9%, exactly what is in nature. We wanted to see in 2000 how the farmers are doing. Well, they checked the survey of a lot of farms, and they said that the farms in California are at 1%, actually 1.1%. They said, perfect, right where you want it. Not 40%. Now, they did say that they were organic. So they did say that some of the farmland right around the delta near Sacramento are reclaimed marshland, and some of those farms were 40% organic. And they did mention that these farms can only grow seasonal crops that took a few months to grow, and they had to manage their watering very carefully because things would rot in that soil very easily. So we know that organic matter in the ground can cause trouble. It does occur in nature, but it doesn't usually occur where plants like to grow. So
why is it that my sister, who lives in Maine, and she has the most wonderful crops in the summer, and they have sheep, so they put manure on, and I don't know what.
Well, as long as they don't put too much at one time. So we were next to a farm for 4 years. Every year they put organic matter in the ground.
In the ground?
Yeah, and this is what it looked like afterwards. They put down about, I think it's about 5 cubic yards per acre, which is enough to cover the ground, but not much more than that.
Yeah.
So when you dig in, 5 cubic yards per acre, when you spread it out, it's like that thick.
Yeah.
And you dig it in a foot deep, this is what you get. You don't see much in there.
So you can't dig it in.
The farmers have to dig it in. So I was told the farmers have to dig it in because if they don't, it blows away in the wind.
Oh, okay.
So they're forced to dig in organic matter, but they don't use much. It's like 1%, which was what about this is. I mean, in this jar, there's like two pieces I can see floating in here. That's the organic content of the soil. It's just very, very small. So that's healthy soil if there's not much organic matter. And anytime you get anything above a few percentage points, you're going to wipe out the roots. The roots can't breathe in it.
Yeah.
They're not getting enough oxygen.
Fascinating.
So anyway, we can show you real fast now. In general, if your soil, if the soil the plant's coming in is good soil, it's something that we grew. You can put it in sandy soil, you can put it in clay soil, nothing's going to happen. If it's not in good soil and it's in this composty stuff, then it's nice to get rid of it before you plant it, or at least compensate for it. One way to compensate, if you put a plant in clay soil, is to surround it with very airy soil. So you can take a plant, say, now this is what the U.S. Department of Agriculture said. If you're planting a 24-inch box and you put it in dirt, don't add anything to the dirt because they already know that that's wrong. What they're telling people to do is surround this plant with air pipes.
Air pipes?
A 2-inch PVC with holes drilled in it, fill it with gravel, so the roots of this tree can still breathe, even though it's surrounded by clay. So that's the problem we have is containers have air holes in the bottom, or a wood box breathes all through it. And you stick this thing in the ground, the air doesn't penetrate more than a foot. The roots are suffocating at the bottom of the hole, so they said put air pipes. Now, the option of that is you just put a lot of stuff around that breathes really well. Both our potting soils, if you just stuck them in around this plant, will breathe quite well. And that'll be a substitute for the air pipes. So you can just surround a plant with our soil. It's like surrounding with sand. And even if this has got...
in a container now?
No, in the ground.
Oh, in the ground.
Container's fine. You can do the same thing in a pot. So if you surround it with our soil, a lot of times that's good enough airflow that the plant will just do fine, even if this soil is not right. Now, one of our good friends who's a landscaper says he's always surrounded plants that he plants in people's yards with pure sand. And we've seen that at the LA airport. When they planted the LA airport in the 80s, they had a cement truck following the people planting the plants, and they were surrounding each box tree. It was either palms or bird of paradise, whatever they're planting there. They're just using a cement mixer to pour in wet sand around these trees. And that's how they did it.
Just pour it around.
Yeah.
A few inches away.
Yeah, it might have been, I don't know, I didn't see them doing it, but they said they surrounded each tree with sand to make sure it breathes well. So that's one way to do it.
So is it on top and it's just sand down? Or I mean,
Yeah, there's just all around this thing they put sand.
Yeah.
Now, our acid mix is pumice, half pumice, and pumice rock, even if you have pure clay, if you make this, your soil 20% pumice, the clay is supposed to breathe. Our acid mix is half pumice rock, so we just tell people if you got clay, you mix it 50-50 with your clay soil with our acid mix, and you'll have breathable clay.
Well, I need to ask you about the specific thing. I'm about to take out my winter crop, which I seem to grow the best in this certain garden in my south side. I'm going to rip out my end of my kale season and my winter pea, the sugar snap peas.
Snap peas,
when that finishes, and then I want to plant something for summer, and also I want to plant 3 tomato plants in these pots. Okay, the soil that I have, I've been working on for years, trying to make it good, adding my compost from my compost heap and stuff, and that I'm hearing is not very good. I should put it on top, right? Okay, this soil needs to be changed, or some needs to be taken out, or some of this in.
Yeah, if you've added year after year of compost to ground, at that point I would say get rid of the soil and start over. You can do a little at a time. In fact, it's always good to see it for yourself. If you took out, your compost emitted soil on one side, put in just straight sand on the other side, or our acid mix, either our acid mix or just pure sand on the other side, and then just put compost on the surface and see how the plants do, compare how well they do.
That would be kind of a fun thing to do.
Yeah, because we did all that 20, 30 years ago almost now. We did all those comparison tests. It's just to prove it to ourselves that it works.
Okay.
So it's nice to do it that way. See in your own eyes that sand or our potting soils work about as well as sand does in a much lighter weight. See how well it turns out.
Okay. The other thing, I'm going to put, these pots that are this big in there, and I just bought last year all new soil. I'm trying to think what I got, what I put in. I think I got it at Rogers or something. Probably has some compost. Probably that, yeah. actually, they did pretty well. So now, do I have to throw all that soil away? I paid all that money.
I would.
Just get rid of it and for tomato plants.
Put real dirt, yeah, either real dirt. I mean, our soils are permanent. Sand is permanent.
Yeah.
Once you have a permanent soil, you just have to watch your crop rotation, which is next week's class.
Just rotate it.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
And then it should work forever.
Maybe I should just have one crop, because I can't afford too many bags of this stuff. Okay. Okay. And
No.
then I have in my front, I have azaleas that have been there for a long time, and sun kind of azaleas. And then there's an area that I dig up, just a small area that I put annuals usually. And it's always a pain because the roots are always coming in. And that's where I put a 6-pack of the violas that I bought here. And they were so beautiful for about 2 weeks. And now I can see they're starting to rot. Okay, so what should I do? Should I empty out? Because that little bed, it's not that big. And
Yeah, because we did that too. So we had a bed that we were growing pansies, and they kept rotting on us. So we just scraped off about 6 inches of it and put pure acid mix in there, and then replanted. And those pansies lasted 2 years.
Really? Oh, wow.
Yeah, the heat doesn't bother them very much when the soil breathes well. And same thing we found. We found that a lot of the annuals will make it perennial, become perennials when the soil is done perfectly.
So if I have this much, how many bags?
Say 3 by 5 would be 15 square feet if you go half a foot deep. So if it was a foot deep, you need 15 bags. Or so if you go half a foot deep, you need 7.5 bags for that area.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, we did one huge bed. It was like 10 by 10 with straight acid mix about 6 inches deep, and we couldn't believe how long the pansies lived in it. And lobelia, I always thought lobelia hated the summer until we put it in straight acid mix, and they made it several years.
I used to love lobelia, but then I couldn't see it.
Yeah.
Do you have lobelia here?
Yeah, we have lobelia. So one more thing we'll show you. So if you're planting a plant that someone else grew and you want to fix the dirt on it, usually what we do is we cut it back because we're going to put this thing into shock. This was too big to begin with, so we'll cut a lot of that off. And then to get the grower soil off of this, you can just stick it on your lawn, take the hose out, blast away. Now we usually I used to use a sharpened chopstick. Someone gave me this little plastic probe, which is nice. And so if you don't want to waste water, you can just pick at it. But water is the most gentle way to get the soil off the roots.
Okay.
And then you don't have to take it all off. If you get 80% of this off, then it shouldn't rot after that, and then get it into your native soil, or you can get it into our soils, water it right away. The roots are generally in shock for a few weeks, so it's nice to put something large next to it, like you can set a trash can nearby, shade it for part of the day, and it should be fine. We like to see them in half a day of shade or so, take some of the stress off the foliage until the roots get going. It takes 2 weeks for the roots to recover from it.
So
now,
you're talking about any plant like that?
Yeah, any plant that we did not grow, if you want to make certain that it does better, it's better to change the dirt on it when you plant it. And it doesn't have to be all of it, but quite a bit of it. It's easy to do 1 gallon, not quite as easy to do 5 gallon. Once you get to the larger 15-gallon buckets, it's real hard to handle those. And it's harder to shade the plants that are that big too. If it's cloudy weather or if it's the middle of the rainy season, no big deal, you can do it. Indoors, no problems. Indoors, any indoor plant. We only have one indoor plant grower we think that does proper soil. Everybody else is doing almost 100% organic matter, which means that it's just the soil is going like this through the year.
So I just transplanted this plant that when I visited Sweden, it's been about 4 years ago, 5 years ago maybe. I got it, and I loved it. It was indoors, and it was this giant thing, beautiful leaves. And so I took a cutting in my suitcase, and anyway, I have it on my kitchen sink, and I just put it in a bigger pot, like this. And so, and I bought here one of those
Mm-hmm.
things, like a espalier,
Mm-hmm.
bamboo thing. Anyway, but I just realized that probably I should just take it outside, dump the soil out, and what should I fill it with?
Either one of our soils will work. Actually,
which would be the best? Because I haven't ever bought the top,
well, for indoor plants, we actually like a looser soil, even looser than either one of these, ideally. So if you get some pumice rock, so some of this pumice rock, and mix it with their top pot, maybe 50-50, you'll get a very light weight soil that doesn't hold quite as much water, and the indoor plants will probably actually do better in that mix.
Okay. Well,
So
this plant looks great, actually. I might wait till after I get home.
yeah.
But so you can get pumice here?
Yes, we sell pumice. It's on one of our displays.
Okay.
In our top pot.
So you say the top pot. So maybe I'll get a bag of top pot and how does the pumice come?
Small. We have real small bags of it, or have the big bags too.
Okay.
Just mention for you folks at home, our next week's class will be on the other topics: watering, fertilizing, mulching, and crop rotation.
Oh, okay.
So.
I probably should do that. Okay.
Okay.